Paying more for groceries and gas lately? Senators just fought over whether the president's tariffs are to blame and who's allowed to impose them. You decide.
Mr. President,
The senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I urge unanimous consent to enter this letter from U.S. Trade Representative Greer into the congressional record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this letter restricts the president's tariff authority under the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act. This is a small but meaningful victory for all Americans who continue to suffer under this president's reckless tariffs. Let's be clear, Putin is a war criminal, and his war machine must be stopped. But we should not have to choose between putting a check on Putin's aggression and putting a check on this president's tariff regime. That is a false choice, and it is one that I am not willing to accept. And so I hope in the coming hours that we go further during the amendment process. I hope my colleagues will join me in stripping out any new presidential tariff authorities. These are not normal times. This is not a normal president. If you give him an inch, he will take a mile. We don't have to imagine, we are seeing it in real time. And everyday people, as a result of that, are struggling to buy groceries, struggling to buy gas, struggling to buy their kids back-to-school supplies. They are the ones who are suffering the consequences of his reckless tariffs regime. But this commitment that we were able to get from Ambassador Greer is meaningful, because if the president ignores the law, if he oversteps his power, we will see him in court. I hope this week-long process was the first step in Congress reasserting its role and placing guardrails on this president's tariff regime. I urge my colleagues to go back home and talk to ordinary folks outside of the Beltway. They will tell you that while they support any efforts to protect our national security, and that's what this is about, this isn't just about Ukraine, it is about our own national security. But we must do everything to protect our national security while at the same time bolstering the economic security of everyday Americans. So as we go back home, ask any parent you meet how much back-to-school shopping cost them this year. I can tell you as the father of 2 small children that it is much more than they wanted to spend. When we come back to Washington, we can fight for those parents and build on this work to check the power of this reckless president. But I'm glad that we've gotten as far as we have on this issue. I'd like to thank my friend and brother, Senator Cassidy, for your partnership in this amendment process. And I'd like to thank Senator Shaheen and Blumenthal for their efforts to find a solution and a way forward to support Ukraine, to protect our national security and our economic security at the same time.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I fully support taking tougher action against Russia. They have waged a deadly, years-long war on Ukraine, and the United States must do more to tighten the screws on the Putin war machine. So I am fully in favor of strong sanctions. But this bill, despite its title, is not just a sanctions bill. It gives Donald Trump massive new tariff authority that he can use to threaten our trading partners and raise prices on the American people. I believe senators will come to deeply regret voting to give Donald Trump this tariff authority. This bill gives Trump so much discretion that he can ultimately decide what countries to tariff or what countries to exempt. He can modify tariffs at his will. Over the last year and a half, Americans have seen what Donald Trump will do with unchecked tariff authority. They have seen his tariffs raise prices for Americans and their families on everything from food to housing to health care. Americans have seen small businesses and family farms shut down because they cannot afford massive new taxes on machinery and merchandise. The Trump tariffs go on again and off again, disrupting supply chains and making it difficult for businesses to plan, invest, and hire. Our allies, including Canada and the EU, openly question the reliability of our nation and are looking to other countries for more stable trade relationships. As Trump turns the tariff dial up and down to punish or reward countries as he likes, the process ends up being a corrupt taxing of the American people to settle Trump personal political scores. If Congress passes this bill with these tariffs, members will be condoning the tariff chaos of the last year and a half and inviting more. This bill gives Trump clear authority to put tariffs up to 100% on the goods Americans buy from major trading partners around the globe. That includes 100% tariffs on things like food, medicine, machinery, and electronics. Congress would even be letting Trump put tariffs on allies like Hungary, Slovakia, France, Belgium, and Japan. Donald Trump can pick and choose even more countries to tariff every 180 days. That's because there is no mechanism in this bill, none whatsoever, for Congress to roll back the Trump tariffs. Trump can increase or decrease tariffs just by notifying the Congress of his decision. He's not going to be constrained by any kind of paperwork or rules. Colleagues, this body has been fighting tooth and nail to stop Trump from abusing the laws already on the books. Trump has shown us repeatedly he won't be limited by the spirit of the law. He'll use any loophole to slap tariffs on our allies and make life more expensive for Americans. The Trump tariffs are now raising prices, hurting our alliances, and opening the door to corruption. This bill will further increase the cost of living for American families when they're struggling. So all of my colleagues who've said, look, we want to hold down the cost of living, we want to make life more affordable, this is not going to do that. This is going to increase the cost of living for Americans as we go into the next few months. It'd be a nightmare for the Americans who want to see their government tackle the affordability crisis. It would be a dangerous mistake to sign our names on a blank check that gives Trump even more power to indiscriminately use these tariffs. So I urge my colleagues this morning to support the Paul Wyden amendment, which would strike this new tariff authority. It would make sure that we're not giving Trump power to tax our constituents for the things they buy from trading partners around the world. There is no need to include this new tariff in the bill. And the fact that the White House won't support the bill without new tariff powers should scare every senator in this room. Trump has shown over the last year and a half that he can't be trusted with unilateral power on tariffs. Everything he's done suggests that he's going to abuse this power, and I urge my colleagues this morning to vote yes on the Paul Wyden amendment to prevent this body from handing Donald Trump a new tool for inflation and corruption.
Republican Congress, I offer an amendment that strikes the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on an ever-changing list of countries. Mark my words, this will be the largest tax increase by a Republican Congress. Why would Republicans who promise you they want to lower your taxes be voting to raise your taxes $500 billion? In addition, Congress should not delegate its constitutional duties to the executive branch. Now, my amendment does not touch the sanctions, the broad sanctions that are provided by the bill, nor does it touch the specific tariffs on Russia, because I see the strong desire among members of the Senate to use economic warfare against Putin. But I object to economic warfare against the American consumer. Once upon a time, Republicans were distinguished from Democrats by their persistent chant that the U.S. deficit was the result of a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Yet today, many Republicans have become the cheerleaders for more revenue. The bill before us grants the executive branch the power to raise nearly $500 billion in revenue, in taxes. I hope I am not the only Republican left in Congress who is horrified by a bill that proposes to raise taxes $500 billion. In addition, there is the constitutional question. Can Congress delegate its Article 1, Section 8 authority to lay taxes and levies? Can they just give it away to the executive branch? For 100 years or more, the Supreme Court has said we can't give away our power. And why wouldn't? In what world would we want to give away our power? The power to tax and spend was given to Congress. Why would they give that to the president? What sort of feckless Congress gives away their constitutional power? The power was divided for a reason. Montesquieu said if you bring the legislative powers together with the executive, you'll have no liberty. The powers were divided between the legislature and the executive so we could fight for liberty, so it would make it hard to raise taxes. The answer, can Congress give away its power, is an unequivocal no. Embedded within our Constitution is something called the non-delegation principle, which states that Congress cannot delegate its core legislative powers to another branch of government or to private entities. The Supreme Court used to enforce this non-delegation doctrine, most notably in the Schechter Poultry case. But that case was decided in 1935, and for much of the intervening years, the Supreme Court has been a reliable ally to lazy legislators. Up until recently, the Supreme Court effectively relieved Congress from the hard work of legislating. But the tide is turning, frankly, with the help of several of President Trump's nominees. Justice Gorsuch forcefully made the case for reviving the non-delegation principle by arguing that if Congress could pass off its legislative power to the executive branch, legislation would risk becoming nothing more than the will of the current president. The problem with this legislation is that it disobeys the clear command of the Constitution. Taxes and levies must be determined by Congress. Moreover, taxation bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Do not let sympathy for Ukraine blind you to the reality of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports that are paid by Americans. They are paid by parents trying to provide for their families. They are paid by students saving up to buy their first car. Tariffs are paid by anyone who seeks to spend money on any conceivable product. There will be those who will try to pull the wool over your eyes and tell you that despite this persistent sticker shock, despite the feeling that life just keeps getting more and more expensive, the tariffs are always paid by somebody else, by some foreign country. The members who vote for this tax will tell you not to worry. These tariffs will only be levied on foreign countries. This absurd claim is provably false. Figuring out who pays tariffs is easy. All you have to do is look at those who are getting refunds. When the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, a whole bunch of people lined up for refunds. Who's not on the list? The Chinese government's not on the list. Canada's not on the list. Mexico's not on the list. American companies are getting the refunds because Americans pay tariffs. And do you think the company pays the tariffs? No, they pass it along to the consumer. You're all paying higher prices. Every time you get something through retail, you're paying higher prices. The entities that lined up for the rebates after the Supreme Court struck down the emergency tariffs were primarily American retailers such as Walmart, Target, Costco, Nike. Let me repeat, China is not on the refund list because China doesn't pay the tariffs. American importers and retailers pay the tariffs, and they pass the cost of the tariffs on to the consumer. You don't have to take my word for it. a letter was sent to the Senate Republican and Democrat leaders by 24 industry associations, including the Chamber of Commerce, the Consumer Technology Association, the National Retail Association, warning about the cost of tariffs imposed by this bill. Here are some quotes from industry concerned about these new taxes. The potential of a new broad 100% tariff on imports from secondary countries risks raising costs for American businesses, workers, and consumers. These new tariffs, that approach would effectively tax U.S. importers and consumers for foreign governments' energy decisions, conduct that is outside the control of the American companies. They further say tariffs of this scale would increase costs for everyday consumer goods, manufacturing inputs, and other products, while creating significant uncertainty for companies making, sourcing, pricing, and inventory decisions for months on end. It could also lead to retaliatory tariffs against U.S. exports. So it doesn't necessarily help exports to tax imports, because the other countries then will tax our exports. Tariffs are a blunt tool, they say, that can penalize law-abiding U.S. companies importing legitimate goods, invite retaliation, complicate trade negotiations, and shift costs onto American families without ensuring that pressure reaches the intended actors. These 24 associations end their letter by saying, "We urge Congress to remove the tariff authority from the bill and instead focus on targeted sanctions, stronger enforcement against sanction evasion, and coordinated diplomacy with countries purchasing Russian energy." Anybody concerned with the economic well-being of American families would come to the same conclusion. But it's not easy to find such common sense in Congress. Imposing a 100% tariff on all goods imported from countries like China and India is the economic equivalent of shooting ourselves in the foot. Middle and low-income Americans enjoy a higher quality of life when they have more purchasing power for everyday necessities. Recent tariffs are estimated to have already cost the average American family $1,700. So the average American family is already paying $1,700 more because of these taxes that are placed on the things you buy. Now this Republican Congress, after it just gave the American people tax cuts, is going to do the opposite. Which is it? Are we the party of lower taxes or higher taxes? This will be the largest tax increase in recent history, perhaps the largest tax increase that a Republican Congress has put onto the people. What are we going to say to the parents buying their kids new shoes for school year, the minimum wage worker who needs to buy a new part to fix their car to get to work, or the single mother buying diapers when they notice that their prices have doubled? The costs of the tariffs are not strictly monetary. These tariffs threaten to undermine America's strategic position in the world. Some naively think that the tariffs will get China to distance themselves from Russia. But it might be the opposite. Recent history suggests that they will instead push Russia and China together. China's not going to get this 100% tariff and say, "Oh, we're sorry. We're no longer going to cooperate with Russia. We've kind of forced Russia to give us this great deal on oil and gas that we pipe into our country, but we're sorry now, and we're going to give up on that." No, it's going to push them closer together. The people that we are worried about are going to become more allied. Slapping a 100% tariff on China may inadvertently solidify the geopolitical alignment with Russia, as Beijing would become more, not less, reliant on Moscow for economic and diplomatic support. Ryan Young is a senior economist with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He points out that Russia is the junior partner in the alliance with China. Young reminds us that China agreed to a second natural gas pipeline between the two countries on the condition that Russia sell China its gas at a lower than market rate. You think China's going to give up on that? No, China will continue to buy its oil and gas from Russia after this, and they in all likelihood will respond to our tariffs with tariffs of their own. This is what's going to happen. It is not going to solve the situation. It's going to raise American taxes, drive Russia and China together, and then China will actually add tariffs on our goods as well. It's a huge mistake. Imposing tariffs on China will reignite the trade war. Beijing will certainly retaliate with their own tariffs and export controls. Maya Nicolazzi, the Deputy Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, reminded us that on Liberation Day, the tariffs placed on China in April 2025 didn't change Beijing's behavior. Instead, those tariffs prompted China to restrict exports of critical rare earth elements. We already tried this once. They responded by restricting their exports of things we need to make batteries for cars, and then we eventually ended up negotiating lower tariffs. Do we want to go through the same world of that again? Likewise, imposing a 100% tariff on India at a time when we are actively trying to court them to help us in our competition with China is completely self-defeating. Ryan Young with the Competitive Enterprise Institute worries that imposing tariffs on India will alienate one of the most important strategic partners in Asia and a potential counterweight to China. So as we try to get India to be more aligned with us instead of with China or Russia, admirable goals, we put tariffs on India, and what does that do? It pushes them more towards China and more towards Russia. It is also unclear if tariffs could even be imposed on individual members of the European Union, like Slovakia and Hungary, given Europe's common trade policy. In 2025, U.S.-EU bilateral trade was over $1 trillion. That is making both parties rich. We have become extraordinarily rich as a country as international trade has expanded. In fact, prosperity of the individual, prosperity of the country is directly proportional to the amount of trade. Think about that. Trying to tariff individual EU countries directly undermines President Trump's recent U.S.-EU trade agreement. Should the EU retaliate against the U.S., the result will be disastrous for both American businesses and consumers. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment that strips the counterproductive tariffs from the legislation. If not adopted, Congress should reject this strategic blunder of a bill that will do nothing to bring peace to Ukraine, but rather raise American prices for American consumers, further weaken the dollar, destroy U.S. relations around the globe, and drive our adversaries closer together. I recommend a yes vote on the Paul Wyden amendment.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Just very briefly, my colleague has hit a number of key points, and to close, I just want to make a couple of points. The American people who are following this debate, I'm sure, think that stuff can be corrected, stuff can be changed, and the reality is, under this particular bill, Congress has no authority to modify this deeply flawed piece of legislation. So the reality is, in the next few months, when we've got folks who are walking an economic tightrope here in America, balancing the food bill against the fuel bill and the fuel bill against the rent bill and the like, they're going to come to their elected officials and say, I'm getting pounded by these new tariffs. I'm just getting hit by an economic wrecking ball. Do something about it. Under this legislation, Congress cannot, modify this bill. It's just not possible. So what we're going to have to do is make sure that the American people get some additional attention in other areas of the economy, because under this legislation and under these tariffs, they are going to get hit by an economic wrecking ball. And it is an unforced error that doesn't have to happen.
I call up amendment number 6715 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, for himself and others, proposes an amendment number 6715 to amendment number 6711.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kentucky.
the bill before us contains the largest tax increase ever passed by a Republican Congress. Worse yet, the bill transfers the taxing authority from the legislature to the executive branch, an unconstitutional delegation of power. The Constitution clearly states that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and excises. Madison believed the Republic would survive only if the Constitution divided the power and pitted the executive ambition against legislative ambition. Madison would be horrified by the clamor of so many in Congress to cede the taxing authority. My amendment strips the transfer of the taxing authority from the bill. My amendment, if it passes, will demonstrate that Congress still has a spine, still has ambition, and still supports the separation and limitation of power.
Mr. President.
Who yields time in opposition?
Mr. President, Russia has been condemned for years, but what it has not yet faced is a cost high enough to change its course. Senator Lindsey Graham understood that. The bill he left us, his final legislative legacy, does not stop at symbolic penalties or mere gestures. It's a strategy. It's a strategy to impose real costs on those sustaining Russia's war machine. Lindsey, who was a friend of mine, understood what it would take. Not another statement of outrage, but a serious plan. A plan to make continuing this war more costly than ending it. And it starts with an uncomfortable truth. We cannot choke off the war chest while Russia's largest customers keep replenishing it, even as those same governments insist they want the war to end. The United States, however, has leverage, enormous leverage. Access to our market carries enormous weight. Our allies know this, our adversaries know it, and the governments buying Russian energy certainly know it. But we should remember that tariff threats of this magnitude do not stop at the doors of a foreign ministry. They have real-world consequences. They can reach factory floors, farms, small businesses, and family budgets here at home. That doesn't mean we shouldn't act. We should act. But if Americans might absorb some of these costs, they deserve a policy that is transparent, disciplined, and tied to well-defined objectives. That's why Congress has a responsibility to ensure that these authorities remain focused on their intended purpose with clear standards governing when additional pressure is warranted and when demonstrated progress should be recognized. The bipartisan support for this legislation sends a clear and a very important message. The pressure authorized here is directed at the countries financing Russia's war and must remain tied to that mission. Full stop. The goal and the result Congress should demand is a race to the bottom among Russia's largest energy buyers, with each country competing to cut its purchases faster than the others. But a race only works when every participant knows the rules, when every participant understands the objective and trusts that meaningful action will be recognized. If countries buy more Russian energy, if they conceal transaction, or if they help Moscow evade sanctions, well, the president has every right to increase pressure. And I'll have my encouragement. At the same time, if countries cut those purchases, stop enabling Russia, and demonstrate that change with real evidence, our policy should respond accordingly. That is how leverage produces action, instead of simply imposing costs. And as this legislation moves forward through the process, I look forward to working with Chairman Crapo and the administration to keep these tariff authorities focused and on the threats Congress intends to confront, the very threats Lindsey Graham worked so hard to confront. This bill presents a simple proposition. Countries may finance Russia's war, or they may enjoy the benefits of access to the U.S. market, but They shouldn't expect to do both without consequences.
This was a Senate debate that looked like it was about Russia, but the real fight was about power and taxes right here at home. The Senate was passing a sweeping sanctions bill aimed at Moscow. The argument that broke out was over one tool buried inside it, a tariff, and it split both parties. Let's untangle it fairly. One ground rule, because this one is easy to get wrong. Almost everyone in this debate agreed on sanctioning Russia. The disagreement was narrower, whether to hand the president a powerful new tariff weapon to do it. So this isn't soft on Russia versus tough on Russia. It's a fight over who gets to control tariffs, Congress or the president. Start with what the bill actually does. Here are the documented facts. The bill is a major Russia and Iran sanctions package. It carries two separate tariff tools. One puts tariffs as high as 500% on goods coming from Russia itself, oil, gas, uranium. The second, the one that caused the fight, lets the president put tariffs of up to 100% on other countries that keep buying Russian energy. Think China and India. That second tool is the flashpoint. And it's important to be precise about that 100% tariff because it's easy to confuse. It is not the president's general across-the-board tariffs you've heard about. It's a targeted secondary tariff, a form of pressure aimed only at the top handful of countries that keep funding Russia by buying its oil and gas. Supporters call it narrowly scoped. Critics call it a blank check. Both are describing the same provision. Now, the backdrop that makes this a constitutional fight. This is the piece that changes everything. Earlier in 2026, the Supreme Court ruled, 6-3, that the president could not impose sweeping tariffs on his own by declaring a national emergency. The Constitution gives the power to tax and set tariffs to Congress, not the president. So when this bill proposed handing the president broad new tariff authority by statute, critics said Congress was voluntarily giving away the very power the court had just protected. So here's the case for striking the tariff. Rand Paul led this side, and his argument had two parts. First, economics. Tariffs are taxes paid by American importers and families, not by Russia, and this one was scored as roughly a $500 billion tax. Second, the Constitution. Congress can't just hand its taxing power to the executive branch. Crucially, Paul still backed the sanctions and the tariffs on Russia itself. He only wanted to strike the new 100% power over other countries. Democrats like Ron Wyden and Raphael Warnock joined that concern from a different angle. Their worry was less about free trade and more about checks and balances. After the court had just curbed the president's tariff power, they didn't want to grant him sweeping new authority they believed he would use unpredictably. Wyden warned the bill gave the president so much discretion he could decide on his own which countries to tariff and which to spare. Now the case for keeping it. Give the other side its strongest form. The bill's supporters, a big bipartisan majority, argued the secondary tariff is leverage. The point is to make it costly for countries to keep bankrolling Russia's war by buying its energy, and to push Moscow toward the negotiating table. Todd Young and others framed the whole package as a moral signal of support for Ukraine, and they noted the tariff was written to hit only the largest buyers, with exceptions for smaller ones. That's a serious argument. So how did it end? Here's the outcome. Paul's amendment to strip the 100% tariff failed, 32-64, so the tariff stayed in. Then the full bill passed overwhelmingly, 86-11, with support from both parties. So the sanctions are moving forward, and so is the new tariff authority. It still has to pass the House and be signed to become law. The constitutional question the critics raised does not get resolved by this vote. So strip it down. Both sides here had a real point. Supporters are right that the tariff is a genuine lever against Russia and that the vote was strongly bipartisan. Critics are right that it's a tax Americans ultimately pay and that Congress just handed the president tariff power the Supreme Court recently said he couldn't take on his own. This wasn't left versus right. It was a fight over the balance of power itself. Watch three things from here: whether the House keeps the 100% tariff or strips it, whether the president actually uses the new authority and against whom, and whether the courts are asked to weigh in again on who controls tariffs. Those answers, not the floor speeches, will tell you how much really changed. That's our breakdown. Stay with us.